Aduli's associate professor that we first found, and it was Tim Leahy that had seen Aduli on the landline program on chasing omegas with different feeds for inland, and he'd done a lot of work on that. So our first conversation was at Crow's Nest. We were in Crow's Nest in Tim's backyard, and Aduli was in Hobart where he was working at the university there. And Aduli said, "Why do you think you've got something that's different?" I said, "Well, fat doesn't set." Normally when you tell people about the fat not setting, they're thinking it doesn't set on the carcass. It sets on the carcass fine, there's no problems. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't set hard like a sheet of ice when you've cooked, when the fat's coming out of the meat. So, and then Aduli went on to ask why I thought this had happened, and I said because of different breeds in and the way we put them in. And then we actually sent some F2 lambs from Graham Sinclair's and Jack Derrick's, both at Temora, similar genetics but from two different farms. One had a more Dorper background at Jack's, and the other was a wilty pole background, and they came up with very similar figures. Some lambs were in better condition than others. From Sinclair's were probably a bit better than Jack's. Jack's actually tested a little bit better, so it didn't matter what condition they were in. And a group of us went down to Hobart and met with Aduli after he ran the tests, and he ran them a second time to make sure they hadn't made a mistake. And that's where it all started. Then Aduli's moved to Townsville, which was a nice sea change or water change there a short time ago. We got washed out and flooded out, and we've continued the association. So there are certain things that you probably ask some questions and Aduli will say, "I can't tell you that," because between Taddy Curl and Jason University we have an agreement that we can only talk about certain things on our testing, but we're like a duck. We're going hard underneath the water. But we can't tell you everything, but we can certainly tell you some things. So I'd like to introduce Aduli. It's been fantastic to work with him. We've even had a meeting with MLA here not long ago, late last year, where we've gone in and Aduli came in on that as well to see if we could talk some sense into them, which didn't work very well. But it's with pleasure that I introduce Aduli, and I'm sure you'll learn a hell of a lot. Thanks, Aduli.
Thanks to Graham and the board for inviting me. You can tell I'm actually from Townsville because I'm feeling cold. I feel like bringing the heater to this side. It's a real pleasure for me to come and talk to you and share some of the data that we've been working with. But like Graham said, I won't be giving you everything. So I am from James Cook University. I work with the College of Public Health, Medical and Veterinary Sciences, but I'm based in the Veterinary Science School, where I teach animal nutrition, animal genetics, and meat science to veterinary science students. I will tell you a little bit about my background towards the end of the presentation. But I just thought I would start off, now that we've had lunch, maybe dessert will be the next thing. I want you to have a look at that cake from where you're sitting. What strikes you the moment you look at that? At first you think maybe it's just an art, but it's actually a real cake that's produced by my next door neighbor. So she's from Austria, really talented, really gifted. Now I'm not doing any PR for her, but all I'm trying to say is that when you see something like that, the first thing that draws your attention is the attractiveness, the appeal. Something about it tells you, oh, that looks beautiful. What would it be like? And then if you zoom in a little bit from the top, you see that what she had done is to produce that cake, including the flour that's in there, was actually, everything in there was just cake. So I took that to work, and everyone rang the other to say, come and have a look at this cake. And it took another 30 minutes of people saying, should we eat it? It's too beautiful to be eaten. But they did eat at the end. So the first first thing that draws you to something is the attractiveness. But why do we consume meat anyway? I thought maybe we should start with the basics. Why red meat? Why lean meat? It is because you can't get much iron from any other source as much as you would get from meat. You come to think of the vitamin B12 groups, meat produces some of the best vitamin B12 that you can get, and that's really good for the immune system. And you talk about protein, the source of protein that comes in, we can't get any better than that coming from meat. And most importantly, when you then talk about the omega-3 fatty acids, that's where we find that meat comes in really strongly, even though naturally we can't synthesize much of the omega-3 fatty acids. So talking about meat quality, like I said, the first thing that hits you is the attractiveness. And that's the top of the range, where you have the Wagyu. You look at the Wagyu, you look at the marbling, your taste buds begin to tell you, I'd like to have a taste of that. And that's even the top range. And then you look at the taste as well. So apart from just having a look, being attracted to it, you also want it to be tasty. So the Wagyu certainly is right at the top there, but very closely linked to that, you also want something that melts in your mouth. And this brings me home to the Australian white. It is not right up there as the Wagyu, but I have clearly used that term, Wagyu of the lamb world, because it's not just about the marbling, but the fact that it produces a unique set of fats that are not only healthy, but they are also very, very conducive for human health. So what are the consumers looking for? When you're talking about meat quality, you put the consumer at the center because he is or she is the person you want to satisfy. And there are key elements to that. So from the carcass production side, you want more of the muscle, more of the meat, and less of the bone. And when you look at the eating quality side, you want something that is tender, you want something that's juicy, and you also want something that has flavor that can attract you. And if you go out into the supermarkets, you find that, the appeal, like we talked about, the sight of it, it comes into play. But where I focus on more is the eating quality as well as the human health. We need more of the omega-3s because we can't synthesize omega-3. All vertebrates have a problem synthesizing omega-3. But when you look at fish and others, they have the natural ability to be able to synthesize omega-3 because they have two key enzymes that we don't have. That's delta-12 desaturase and delta-15 desaturase. I won't bore you with the details of the chemical structures of those. So when you then look at the meat quality, 5 pillars stand out, either as a producer or as a consumer. One, you want something that you can actually enjoy. You produce meat that's really convenient for the person that's cooking. And then we also want value and efficiency. And for us who are farmers, we want to produce something that's ethical, something that can stand the test of time when it comes to the nutritional value. And increasingly, people who consume meat want to be able to trace where that meat is coming from. So the integrity of that meat, the ethical values under which we produce that meat all come into the equation. Now the main thing I want to hammer on this afternoon is that marbling is key to eating quality, but marbling does not necessarily equate to eating quality. Now I'll show you some work that we did with Wagyu. Some years ago I worked with Wagyu down in Tassie when they were still producing purebred Wagyu, and this was at the Tasmanian feedlot out in Tauranga. And they had Mr. Inoue there, who is actually from Japan, who had just the one singular act of looking after marbling and the meat quality. So he would come to the abattoir, He will look at every single carcass, and the only thing he's looking for is, does this meet the minimum threshold in Japan? So would go out there, and you would see that there's that heavily marbled side in there with the white fats that you have there. That's a lot of fat. The fact that you have so much fat in the meat does not necessarily, convey it or mean that you are having good quality fat. So we wanted to know what makes it really good. What makes it, is it really healthy? Is it unhealthy? So striking the balance between too much fat and having very lean carcass on the other side is what really triggered the research that I got into. So fat quality is the key. So fat quality rather than the quantity is the main thing that we're after. If you produce very lean meat there, like the grass-fed out there, with virtually no intramuscular fat within that muscle, it doesn't have much taste because it's blunt. There's just nothing to bring in the flavor, there's nothing to bring in the juices that go with the good quality. So this is what makes the difference. The melting point of the fat is important because you can distinguish between good fats and bad fats. And I'll be expanding a little bit on that. So with the health component is the omega-3 long-chain fatty acids that we're interested in. And we are also interested in saying, can we modify these things through nutrition? Can we modify these things through genetic selection? And I'll tell the story on those two pathways that we've tried to follow. But what are good fats and what are the bad fats? So up there on the board, what I've put is the saturated fatty acids are the ones that we call really bad. And then the unsaturated fatty acids are the ones that we refer to as the good fat. And the reason is very simple. With the saturated fatty acid, the bonds that are actually binding the carbon atoms are very strong. So what that means is that they're very difficult to break at room temperature. So if you have saturated fat, it then means that at room temperature you'll be having very hard fat, solid, can't really break down. But if you have the good fats, you can almost say that the bonds between the carbon atoms are very easy to break. So at room temperature, they would melt. They will remain as liquids. That's because the molecules are they are easier to break apart. That's just putting it in simplistic terms so that we can get a grasp of where the saturated and unsaturated fatty acids are coming from. So why are these saturated fatty acids very bad? They are bad because they affect the coronary artery. And this is what I mean. So if you've got bad fats or the saturated guys, what happens is that in a normal artery, it's very open like a tube where the blood easily flows through the heart without any problems. But the moment you then have the bad fats here, what they do is they cause an accumulation of plaque. And that's because they deposit more of the low density lipoproteins, so what we call LDLs. So those LDLs begin to clog the area, and before you know it, fat and cholesterol are accumulating in the arteries, and the blood flow is impeded. And that means that not enough oxygen is flowing through the system, and people come down with coronary heart attack. And that's what happens. So to simplify that and put it a bit more graphically, if you look at the LDLs here, so these are the bad guys coming from saturated fats. What they do is they store the cholesterol on that side, whereas the good guys are able to regulate that and make sure that you don't have a buildup. If you then have a buildup, then this is what happens where the blood clots and then it blocks the artery and then there are problems. And this is where the omega-3 fatty acids come in to be able to help with the flow, not just against heart disease, the immune system in terms of pregnancy, retinal development and brain development, they're all really good with the omega-3s. I've just tried to summarize this, that with the omega-3s, they play these key functions. Now, I've sort of qualified that to long chain because we're talking carbon atoms that are longer than 18. I won't go into the details of the chemistry, but why we call them omega-3s is because they have 3 double bonds. That means that you can easily break them at 3 points. So you've got a double bond there, a double bond there, a double bond there, 3 of them. And the most important ones are your ALA, EPA, DPA, and DHA. Don't mind the long names, okay? But these are the 3 key ones that are really good. So they're helpful for eye health, hormone support, inflammation reduction, the nervous system, and even in pregnancy, they're really good in terms of cholesterol support, and it also assists in burning fat and so on and so forth. There's so many functions. So the question we're trying to say is, can we, as Australian-wide sheep breeders, be able to produce sheep from the paddock that combine good taste, good eating quality, as well as health benefits? I've tried to put it on a plate. So can we take these guys from the paddock, looking really good with all the characteristics that Graham has described, good eating quality, and take them right up to the table? And this is where we then think that, yes, you can do that through a nutritional approach, and you can do that through a genetic approach. So with the nutritional approach, what that means is that if you formulated a ration that the animals would be able to take and convert that into meat, then whoever eats the meat should be able to get the benefits of the omega-3s. So it's either you use the healthy fats or fish oil, or you can use a whole range of cold expeller pressed plant oils. And I should say that we've tried many of these routes. One of the earliest ones we used was just pure fish oil. And we fed them to lamb, took the meat into the laboratory, tested it, it was perfect as far as the omega-3 was concerned. And then we got people and said, can you try this meat and tell us? And they're like, is this fish or is this chicken? Because the taste was just totally not correlated with that, and we thought, bad idea. So we went back to looking into the different plant oil sources, and in this regard, we've tried several different oils, trying to strike a balance between the quantity that goes into the feed and the kind of response you get from the sheep. Can we strike a good balance between what we are producing? Now, when you feed sheep pellets that are made out of these oils, you get some response. The moment you stop feeding them, you lose that response. And that's a major problem with a nutritional approach, because you have to keep going back to nutrition. With the genetic approach, on the other hand, which is the second way that we can effect a change, is to say, can we select parents? Can we identify animals that have a natural predisposition to produce high levels and good taste of the meat? If we did select them, would they be able to pass on that genetic superiority to their progeny? And if they can, because it is highly heritable, then we can make choices. And these choices are permanent and they are cumulative, because they can be passed on from one generation to the other. So I'll go through the intensive nutritional management that we have sort of done, where you are concentrating production within an area. You are using nutrition to be able to make sure that the animals are producing as well. So this story started way back at the University of Tasmania, where we'd have sheep at the university farm, where we'd run experiments, where we're feeding them and also monitoring their individual performance. And in that process as well, we were involving our students, teaching them basic animal nutrition, basic animal management. So here, the weighing of the animals, condition scoring, the things that we sort of collect and teach the students how to do hands-on experience. We also make sure that we're getting data on growth. So this would be like practicals would hold every single week. We take them to the farm, they are taking the data, and we're getting back into the laboratory and also analyzing as well. And at this stage too, we have there Barry with me. Barry is a very seasoned vet who is well experienced. For so many years, he had his own practice and then worked with the University of Tasmania as the animal welfare officer. It was advantageous to have him as the animal welfare officer because we were covered. People wouldn't come telling us that we are not looking after the animals really well. But in that process too, we also would take blood samples because we'd extract DNA from those samples. Again, while analyzing in the laboratory, we're also teaching students how they can do the DNA extraction and take blood plasma metabolites. With intensive sheep management, you also have to focus on the ewe, and I'm glad that Graham has mentioned that here, the emphasis was also on the ewe because of embryo transfer, which is something that we also did. Now, the breeding rams were also looked at so that we could select, so that we could see which rams were the best. And you would see that we've worked with different ones, from Dorsets right through to the White Suffolks to F1 crosses with Merinos. We've also looked at semen quality. Again, this was down in Cambridge, where we will use an artificial vagina to be able to collect semen samples, and then we had a portable microscope where we can visually see what rams were good. And out of that, we then got F1s, or the F1 progeny, those beautiful lambs. So we ran a series of experiments, but part of the experimental design in some cases were that would have maybe 5 different breeds, 2 different supplements, 2 feeding levels, and both sexes were also looked at. Now that was just one of the designs. In a more recent design, what we had done was to look at 72 prime lambs, including 36 males and 36 females. We've looked at purebred merinos, Dorset merino crosses, White Suffolk merino crosses. And then we fed one group with just canola oil, another group with rice pollard, and then in between them we've looked at both control, high levels, low levels, to be able to achieve a bit of a balance between them. In design 3, we've also looked at 72 prime lambs, where we've looked at Corriedale merino crosses, White Suffolk Corriedale, and looked at flaxseed and canola oil. And at every stage, we made sure that we were balancing. Everything was well balanced in terms of the diet, in terms of the numbers of animals that we could manage, and not just in meat sheep, but also in dairy sheep as well. So down in Tassie, we had a dairy sheep farm where we'd feed them exactly the same pellets and rations that we had formulated to see if we would get exactly the same or different responses coming in. Like I said, students have been quite involved, where at some stage individual animals are drenched. We'll take body length of continuous nutrition and data taking. Then we take them to the abattoir. And within the abattoir, we'll be able to take all sorts of data that's related to carcass evaluation. And then we'll take samples back into the laboratory. So when we get back into the laboratory, we determine the intramuscular fat. So with the IMF, we used what we call chloroform methanol extraction procedure. Takes a long time for us to be able to then finally get some fat in there, as you can see. And within that, we can tell exactly what is the percentage of the fat that's come from the muscle or the intramuscular fat. Now these days you hear of different technologies like Dexter, video scanning of the area to tell you how much fat. They're all good, but they're not accurate. But with this weight chemistry method, we tell you exactly to about 99.9% accuracy what is the actual intramuscular fat within the muscle. And not only that, we then come to where we look at the fat melting point. So you would see a series of different fats. For each one of them, we would have extracted the IMF. So it's from the IMF that we then go ahead to look at what we call the sleep point. This is the point when the fat sort of melts, and then you look at the thermometer and then take it. It's painstaking, takes a long time. So when you send samples and the samples are taking ages to analyze, know that it's not deliberate. It's because the procedure itself is fairly long. But what's the point if you've done all of that and nobody tastes the meat? Because the eating, or how do they say it? The eating, the taste of the pudding is in the eating. So you have to taste it to be able to know. And I'm glad that Graham and the team here are putting tonight some dinner where you can actually taste and see for yourself whether or not what we say is true. So we have a sensory panel where we get people to taste the meat. So we prepare a barbecue, and usually we sort of prepare that at 70 degrees centigrade, make sure that there's no condiments added, and everyone who eats it, and we're never short of volunteers. Once we advertise, we are looking for volunteers to eat, people will rock up. So we give them bits and pieces of the meat. We have water where they can gargle, and then we give them crackers in between samples so that you are removing the taste of the previous sample so that you're not getting confused. The taste buds aren't getting too confused. So once we do that, we give them questionnaires to fill, and they will be able to tell us what they think about it. So to summarize some of these things, what I thought I would do is to put on a 13-minute video that summarizes 10 years of the work that we've done. And this is coming from ABC Landline that I think that was the program team watched, and then they came over to talk to me in Tassie. So if you will indulge me for a minute, let me just get this straight. So you've got
We leave Queensland now and head south to Tasmania. The health benefits of omega...
Sorry.
We leave Queensland now and head south to Tasmania. The health benefits of omega-3 fatty acids have long been associated with fish, but now scientists in Tasmania have discovered a way to enrich land meat with the heart-protecting compounds. The winning formula is the culmination of 10 years scientific research. Fiona Green discovered more about this extra healthy lamb.
So this is where we're at the moment. So when we looked at EPA, DHA, these are your long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, we found out that meat that's produced right here, so your 30 is actually the threshold of what we call the N3. So if you're able to get up to 30 milligrams, then you are at the source level. And if you're able to then get up to 60, then that's called a good source. And what we've seen is whether you look at the control, they're really struggling to reach that threshold. But once you pump it up with 5% canola or 5% flaxseed, quite easily they're able to meet that threshold there in terms of the serve. We also tried to see if we can look at it within breeds, if we supplemented them. So your MM are the purebred merinos, and your CM are the Corriedale and Merino cross, and the white Suffolk and Corriedale crosses. So what you see here, no disrespect to merinos, because merinos are the grandparents of all that we do, but they're really struggling here in order to reach that as far as juiciness is concerned. But all the other crosses, what you see is that you reach up that well-desired level in terms of the meat juiciness. So we then compiled the meat quality, the sensory characteristics. We asked people to judge the tenderness, juiciness, and overall liking. And the merino that was struggling there still was able to reach that, but you still find that the crosses were doing a little bit better. But all of them are at very acceptable levels of meat sensory acceptability. Now the last bit I want to go through is the genetic selection. So what have we done with the Australian whites? So the first thing is to say, after you slaughter an animal, even if it was good, you've lost it, it's gone. So the key is making that decision, having that information while the animal is still young. And then you can make a decision as to whether to keep it in the herd or not to. So what we decided to do was to look at the longissimus dorsi muscle in the animals when they're still young, bring in a vet, take in a biopsy. So it's a very tiny muscle sample from that area. The animal is stitched up, gets up, walks, because it's not a major surgery. Any veterinarian should be able to do that. So once we take that biopsy, we're taking very tiny samples. So these samples come into us in 5 milligrams. We get them into the laboratory. We label them. We also get the blood samples. So from the blood samples, we're taking the DNA. So we have information on the muscle, and we can work out what the exact intramuscular fat content is, what the melting point is. So you have that information ready, and you can make those decisions really early. So in the laboratory, like I said, we'll then go through the rigmarole of actually painstakingly finding out individual information for every little data that we've taken. So with fat melting point, these are crossbreds that we looked at. I should say that these have nothing to do with the Australian white, but part of the data that we've been working on. If you look at visceral fat here, you find that you are having melting points ranging from about 46 degrees right up to about 47. So that is more on the high side. Then when you look at the subcutaneous fat, it's a little bit low, but you're hitting 42 degrees centigrade. These are your normal F1 crosses that we worked with. Now this is the data that I would share from the Australian white that we've worked. So this is a summary where we looked at samples from 47 sires, 100 ewes. So if you look at the benchmark that we say, this is a reasonable amount if you have fat melting point of 40 to 44. Now you check out the Australian white females. The average was 34.1, the sires was 35.5. And when you actually look at the range, we were having some that were as low as 28 degrees centigrade. Now it was at this point I was telling Graham, I've never seen a lamb breed that has as low melting point as this, because you're actually competing with Wagyus at this stage. And justifiably so, that on the basis of low fat melting point, I can stand anywhere in the world and tell people that yes, these guys are really competing in terms of the fat melting point. And when you look at the intramuscular fat content, it will tell you from our experience, if you have 3.2 to 3.6, you'll get a good eating quality. But check out the Australian white. The ewes were hitting 4.4, and the intramuscular fat content in the sires was 3.4, and we had a range where some were actually hitting 4. And in the females, some actually hit 8.2% intramuscular fat. Now, on the healthy side of it, again, this is without supplementation. So this is just their natural ability without giving them any supplement. Again, you're finding that the sires were hitting 32 milligrams per 100 grams. So remember, I said the threshold for source is about 30. And the best ram was hitting nearly 70. And if I am right here, I think this is the guy we called Mr. Long Chain, because he was just in a world of his own. So when you look at the top 10, that means that 30 kilo Australian white can actually make decisions and say, okay, we're taking the top 10, we're taking the top 10% here, and let's see what the F1s will do. Now, I should also say that at this stage, we've also gone ahead to take their DNA samples. I can't disclose the results of that yet. We're still, mapping them. All I can tell you is that at the moment we have 75 lambs that are in the feedlot where we have designed feeds, different rations to say if naturally they are able to produce this, what will happen if you actually supplement them with the omega-3s? Will they double? Will they triple? Will there be any need for supplementation at all if at this stage they are able to produce this well? Again, these animals are in the feedlot probably now in their 4th week. So we intend to take them right through to 10 weeks and collect every single data. And then back in the lab, we are genotyping them and going through molecular genetic tests, and we will be compiling those results. So in summary, what would be the take-home message from what I've told you? That land eating quality would be the key as far as the international market is concerned. Consumers are tending more towards that. So if we make it a key selection item at this stage when they're still in the paddock, we can dictate what price is paid on them. The second thing is that the marbling quality and not the quantity is the key to eating quality. So the fact that you have heaps and heaps of intramuscular fat doesn't necessarily translate to good quality meat. And that is very important. So the low fat melting point is an indication of really good fat because you've got unsaturated fatty acids, you've got long chain omega-3s correlated with that. And this is where the health benefits come in through the omega-3s. And the other thing I want to say is that with genetics and selective breeding, we can change the game. And if we're consistent in what we do, we know that genetic gains are cumulative and can be passed on from one generation to the other more than nutritional manipulation. So I'll just in case you're wondering, this man from Townsville is still shivering and feeling cold. What is his background? So this just rounding up to give you a bit of my background. So I was born in Nigeria. I was raised in Nigeria, and I schooled in Nigeria, and I come from the central part where we call Plateau State. Our capital is called Jos, and it's quite rocky, quite mountainous area. So I spent most of my growing up age in a tiny little village within Bokos Local Government Council, where it's still natural, the Kura Falls just nearby, and we would come down, play in the stream, run back home. Very simple life. One thing that only took me to the city was to go and school. So we went to school, Jos, which is a much more crowded area, but the school there, boys' secondary school, gave me the first glimpse at trying to reach out into the big city. And that also led me more to a bigger city in Ibadan, and that's where I did a first degree. So at the University of Ibadan, this used to be the University College London campus, formed in 1948, and is actually the oldest university in Nigeria. So between 1983 and 1988, that was when I graduated. I did a degree in animal science, and then moved on from there. In the ancient city of Ibadan, it used to be the largest city in West Africa. At the moment, I think Cairo is probably the largest in Africa or so. But that then took me to a bigger city where I studied. In Nigeria, when you get a first degree, you have to go for national service. It is compulsory for as long as you are under 30. So we call it the National Youth Service. And I served in a state called Ondo State, which is further down south. So nobody gives you a job, nobody employs you unless you can show that you've been discharged from the National Youth Service for 1 year. Now that shouldn't scare you. We were not allowed to carry guns. So we received paramilitary training for a couple of months, and then we got posted to rural areas where our job was mostly development type. So if you studied agriculture, you worked with farmers. If you studied medicine, you worked in the rural area as a GP. And if you were an engineer, you built bridges, you built schools. You did that for 1 year, and then you got your discharge certificate, and then you can go back to do a master's degree or you work. So I completed that and went back to the university. This time I went up north to Ahmadu Bello University, where I got employed as an assistant lecturer. So between 1990 and 1994, while completing a master's degree in animal science, I also was very lucky to win a scholarship to do a PhD. Now, I should say that within ABU, so between 1992 and 1994, as I finished the master's degree, I got lucky that the Australian government gave me a scholarship to come to Adelaide. So I came to the University of Adelaide and spent 4 years doing a PhD. It was during this time that I actually got in touch with Wagyus. So I worked with Wagyus, Herefords, South Devons, Angus, about 7 different crosses looking at fatty acid composition, marbling, and meat quality. Now, I completed that degree in 1998, and I went back home to Nigeria where I was teaching. So I went back to my university in ABU. Because they had allowed me to go out and study, I felt I had an obligation to go back and give back to the system. So I stayed back in ABU between 1999 and 2002. After that, I got bored. So looking for more excitement, I decided to move to Japan. So in Japan, I worked in Tsukuba at the National Institute of Livestock and Grassland Science. And it was in Tsukuba that I worked directly with Wagyus for 2 years, looking at marbling, looking at the genes that actually controlled marbling and pinning it down to chromosomes 2 and chromosome 5. And while in Japan, this man here, Professor Komatsu, was my boss, so I worked under him. And in most cases, we were working with the Tokyo Livestock Association, the Shirakawa Institute of Animal Science, probing through the quality of the different Wagyus that were coming through. So it was mostly gene mapping, quantitative trait loci mapping that I did when I was in Tsukuba. Now, while I was in Tsukuba, the University of Tasmania decided to recruit me. So they brought me from Japan to Hobart. So I came to the University of Tasmania between 2004 and 2016. So for 12 years, 9 months, I was in the cold. And my wife didn't quite like it, so she decided to move to Townsville. I had hoped that the kids will rebel and say, no, we're going to stay with Dad, but no, so I had to pack up and then go up to Townsville. So I moved to JCU in July 2016, like I said, at the Veterinary Science School, where I teach genetics, I teach nutrition, and I teach meat science. That's where I am based today. Most of the work that I've shared with you wouldn't have been done if not because of students and sponsors and people who want to work with us. And right up there you have Tadikio, you do have the Australian Wool Education, ACR, CSIRO, and also these guys here, the honors, masters, and PhD students, and interns, and postdocs. They are really the foot soldiers who really help us to make sure that the work is done. So Peter Nichols that you saw on that ABC one line, he's retired from CSIRO now, but we're still working together. He still works with me at JCU. And these 3 students that you saw in that ABC, they're all Vietnamese students. He has finished and gone back last year. These 2 are finishing in July, so they're at the moment writing their thesis. And our group is actually a multinational, multicultural group, people that work with me. So we have Australians from Victoria, from Tasmania, Iranians, French, Sudanese, Vietnamese, all in the same group that we work together. And again, I couldn't have done that without them. I should mention that Benedict came to us from France last year to do a PhD, so she's still with me in Townsville. Aaron Fleckmore is still in Tassie. He's in Melbourne, he's finished, and he's here in JCU with me. Finally, family. Not because they're the least important, but that's my wife, Bumi. She has been very supportive. It was because of her I had to run to Townsville. And we've got 3 kids. Well, that's our son. These days his mom needs a ladder to be able to reach out to him. I've got a set of twin girls, Paige and Paula. They keep us really busy. In here they're really small, but now they tell me that they are big girls. At 15, they are now big girls. But ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of what we've been doing. And I just want to say thank you for your attention, and I'll take questions. Thank you. Any questions for me?
Aduli, there's a couple.
All right. I've got one, and you probably won't be able to answer this. How long before you're going to give us all the answers?
You're right, it's hard to say. But I think we're getting there. From just 2-3 years ago, I think we've come a long way. With the gene mapping work, at the moment we're zeroing in on 3 major genes, which again, I can't divulge that information, but we're not too far away. We're not too far off.
Are you excited?
Very excited.
More questions? Yep.
On that slide you had where you had your flaxseed at 3.5%. Obviously it was mixed with a grain thing up to 5%. Seems to be that the better result was a higher percentage of oil. How high can you go?
The maximum I would say is actually that 5%.
Is it?
Because the moment you push it beyond 5%, 2 things happen. The first one is that the dry matter intake will go down because it's too energy dense. So if your dry matter intake goes down, what that means is that generally they won't be able to eat as much as they should. And that can have a bit of an impact on them. The second reason is if you go beyond 5%, then the stomach bugs, or what we call the rumen microorganisms, you completely distort their natural ecosystem. So what then happens is that you get more stomach disorders, digestive disorders coming through. So we sort of started at a very low level and tried to push it a bit. Mind you that 5% took us a long time to work out where you're making improvement in terms of nutritional value, but you are not sacrificing eating quality as well. It's just trying to strike that right balance between nutritional value and the eating quality. So I'd say 5% is the maximum you can go.
Which oil was the better one?
The better one was flaxseed oil, but flaxseed oil is very expensive. Before you can get flaxseed oil, it costs a lot. And we try to work out the costs as well, because the farmer would be interested in the cost, and flaxseed was the most expensive. But the one that was reasonable, affordable, easy to access was canola oil, and it was just as good. Rice bran was good, not quite up there, but not bad as well.
This is an observation, and on your taste test panel of the people eating the meat. Now, 7 days ago, I was in the supermarket and there was a consumer there looking at some Scotch fillet steak to buy. And there was some there quite obviously had intermuscular fat in it. And I said to this consumer, take the one with the intermuscular fat in it. She said, oh no, I cannot eat fat. And was really alarmed that I think that I'd mentioned to have the intermuscular fat. Now, what sort of reactions did you get when you had people doing the taste test? Did you come across that sort of reaction?
No, I should have clarified that there are actually 3 different types of fats. So you do have the subcutaneous fat on the outside, which normally at the meatworks, they'll try and trim it before it comes in. Then the second type of fat you have is the intermuscular fat, which is in between the muscles, which can also be cut off. But the intramuscular fat, you can't get rid of it because it's within the muscle. Now, when we were doing this test, for as long as the subcutaneous fat was gone, there were no issues at all. In fact, the aroma attracted them more to that, and the moment they tested it, they wanted that more than any other thing. Now, in Japan, where there's so much emphasis on intramuscular fat marbling, these days, the younger generation, their thinking is a little bit different. They think that, fat is not healthy. But the truth is, the intramuscular fat is actually healthy. It's the subcutaneous fat that's really bad.
think that that would be as simple as just adding canola grain itself, or you specifically want to add the oil?
No, I wouldn't recommend adding just the canola oil to the grain, because when you do that, like I said, palatability goes down. They won't be able to sort of consume that at the level you want them to. But why we put it in the pellet is because it comes in as a whole grain. So it's not just the oil in the pellet. We do give them a full balanced ration. So you've got your ruminant, you have all your minerals mix, you have everything within that. So we strike the right balance between the crude fiber content, then the omega-3 oil within that pellet as well. The delivery is much better, the feed intake is much better, and then when it comes to wastage, you don't get much wastage in a pellet. So my first reaction would be I wouldn't encourage people to just put the fat content. Your water holding capacity is much higher. But the moment you cook that, yes, there's some percentage of shrinkage. I couldn't tell you from the top of my head. It would depend on, Wagyus normally are fed for such a long time before you have that sort of intramuscular fat deposition. It's very hard to give a figure because I don't have access to that sort of figure. But yes, there's some shrinkage. You lose that because the water holding capacity will be impacted upon due to cooking. But it doesn't really tamper with any of the eating quality side of things. Well, you do get some fat that's left. Yes, that's correct. But it also depends on the way you've prepared it. If you've grilled it, or you've barbecued it, or you've just cooked it. It depends on the cooking method. Yeah.
What? Do I have to like?
I'd like you to talk on the streaky side.
Me.
Quite serious, really. What happens when Australian lamb's cooked?
What we talk about?
Well, what are you saying? When you cook the meat, what happens to it?
Oh, we're seeing cooks.
Look, it cooks very easily.
What about is bigger when it's cooked than when it's first put on? So this is something that some of the chefs are saying to us, that when you're cooking the meat, it's actually sucking moisture in. So forget about weight. It's actually the size of the piece of meat. So when they're cooking a chop that's this big, when it's cooked, it's that big.
All right. Well, I thought you were talking about me and shrinkage, so when I was the wrong bloody bloke, like I'm the elephant of the house, so like you wouldn't have thought, you sure you won't just want to have a crack at me or something, Graham? Are you sure? So I can't answer anything about shrinkage, I'm sorry. Sorry, sir.
I was going to ask, have you got any work with trials on natural pastures and crops? Have you used a bit of triticalium or a bit of protein or whatever, or fat leaves, or a combination of seeds in the ground to get the maximum out of the Australian white lamb?
Not with Australian white lambs, but we've done some work where we're looking at just grazing. And we looked at two different pastures. Like if you kept them on pure ryegrass versus pure cock's foot, what does the omega-3 and the meat-eating quality look like? And then we've also supplemented them in addition to grazing to see whether or not there's any additional benefit that comes from that. And the results, those are actually Holmes' PhD project where he looked at that sort of scenario. But as for real planting those different forages or pastures and then trialing the Aussie white, no, we haven't yet done that. At the moment, we're at the feedlot stage where we formulated the ration, 3 different rations, and then we're waiting to see the response that will be to that. Maybe the next phase of the work, if we have the funds to do that, would be an area we would like to look at.
Any more questions? Right.
Just a statement on that. The work that we're doing with Aduli is trying to identify genetics, not feeds. So it's genetic that we're chasing. And as far as feeds that you grow in pastures, New Zealand has told us through some of the marketing that they're doing that chicory is the one that will lift the omega-3 sugar. That is artificially lifted. too worried about artificially finding it. We found genetics where some of these sheep that we tested, like the ewes that we tested, were on dry food, so green food affects it, and will lift your omegas. The sheep that we tested were on dry food, they were tested in January. So that'd be correct and good?
Yeah, so you're right that the focus. Oh, sorry. The focus is actually genetics, no doubt about that. But remember that no matter how good the genetics is, if you don't give them optimal nutrition, they won't be able to express themselves to the level you want them to. So we're trying to cover up all grounds, but the focus is more on the genetics. Can we identify them? How heritable is it? Can they pass it to their progeny? Can we sort of backtrack and develop a unique DNA signature that can tell us these are truly 100% Australian-wide? So that's where we are kind of focusing our efforts at the moment with the Australian-wide.
Yep. Are omega-3s omega-3s, or is there a difference between those that you achieve through nutrition in your earlier tests and those that are natural genetically in the Australian wild? Are they all the same, omega-3s or omega-3s?
No, there's a difference between the omega-3s. The only thing they have in common is that they have 3 double bonds. For instance, the one that has 18 carbon atoms, that's called ALA. You get a lot of ALA coming in from pasture. So if you are a pasture-fed type of farmer, you'll be able to get heaps and heaps of ALA. And ALA on its own is not potent when it comes to the health benefits that we see with omega-3s. But then it serves as a precursor. So before you get from ALA to EPA, there's always like moving from 18 carbon atoms to 20 carbon atoms or 22 carbon atoms. You still need the ALA, but on its own, it doesn't really have any potent impact on the health benefits. So I've seen a couple of people, particularly organic farmers, who say, keeping my animals on pastures, we're getting ALA, ALA is omega-3, omega-3 is omega-3, so it's all good. Well, maybe not, because what we can see is it's only if you have EPA and DHA that we see those clearly defined health benefits, not ALA on its own. And you do have shorter carbon atom chains that are, 3 carbon atoms. So technically speaking, they are omega-3s. But it's only the long chain ones that actually have the health benefits.
I suppose I'm speaking a bit out of term, and it's a long-winded story, but I reckon you'd be the only bloke that'd answer it properly. But a bloke told me once that the reason the Wagyu marbles so well is that years ago when Genghis Khan had them in Mongolia, and that they were the stock that they drove with the farmers through the snow, and they'd kill and eat everything, and then at the end of it, they, whatever survived the snow and no food and whatever, was what bred on. And what this bloke was referring to was the intramuscular fat that was easily accessible for these animals to change into food when they weren't available getting on the ground, for the animals that survived these long drives. The question I pose, if that's the truth, is the Australian white doing the same thing because Graham and everyone drove them so hard in the cold, and the ones that have the intramuscular fat? Is it a wives' tale, or is that something that might be somewhere close to being correct?
Well, I can authoritatively tell you that it's a wild tale. The truth is that if you want to trace the history and genetic development of the Wagyu, there's a book chapter that we wrote, Komaso and I wrote a chapter on the origin of Wagyu, tracing them right from the Meiji era. The reality was that the Japanese actually started with the short horn. So they started off with the dairy breed, which is actually more marbled than what used to happen. But through constant selection for about 60 solid years, focusing on just the animals, you know, the marbling, because they were work animals at first. So when they brought in the shorthorn and then started genetically selecting, and they matched that with some sort of management that I haven't seen anywhere, where animals are really treated so nicely, they are kept indoors, they are given grains, they are talked to, they are brushed, they are given just gentlemanly treatment. When you do that to an animal, and you are actually giving it good nutrition, the longissimus dorsi muscle doesn't do any work. So it's just there, and so it's tender, you get the best meat out of it. And remember that they are a slow-growing breed. So over time, as you feed them, they build up that intramuscular fat. Rather than depositing most of it on their backs, it actually goes into the muscle. So if you trace the history of the Wagyu, it's totally different to what you're hearing. And there are so many myths out there, but authoritatively with some of the literature backing what I'm saying, if you look, the book is called Beef Cattle Production and Trade, and it's produced here in Melbourne, edited by David Cottle and another guy called Louis Kahn. So there's a chapter there where we wrote about the Wagyus, and another chapter on just world beef production. That might help you to straighten the records.
Right.
Aduli, Brian has mentioned that this is really about genetics, and so it's really about, further to really being about genetics, it is also really about the whole reason we're here is to produce meat, as you clearly point out. And the meat that we eat doesn't come from stud animals, it comes from commercial animals. My question is, I can see where you're going down a stud line, where we can afford to do the sort of genetic testing and so on that I assume is going to be available in a relatively short period of time. However, that's only half of it. We will have commercial ewes out there and that will produce the lambs. The lambs will then be eaten. How do we know? How are we going to clearly identify firstly the best ewes to put our good genetically sound animals to do what you're asking them to do? So how are we going to identify the ewes? And then after that, how is the chef going to identify that the lamb that he purchases is going to be of this high quality? I won't try to repeat the numbers because I'll get them wrong, but you know what I'm talking about.
Very good question, and valid too. The stud breeding is more like the foundation of where the genetics would be coming. But down the line, yes, commercials will come in because you would want to sort of crossbreed. Now remember that all this work that I've just shared is probably only 3 years old, so there's still quite a lot to be done. But what I can tell you is that we want to come up with a unique DNA signature. And part of that DNA signature would be a genetic test, where all you need to do would be to just take blood sample or hair sample, send it to the lab, and then we'll be able to give you some information as to be able to help you to make those sorts of decisions. How far away are we from getting that genetic test? Like I said, we're nearly there, not quite there yet, but it's something that would be available for producers to use in order to make those sorts of decisions. Now remember that the purebreds that you use can only pass 50% of their genetic makeup. Now, unless we work out and know precisely what the heritability of the trait is, we probably won't be able to answer those questions specifically. But we already know that intramuscular fat content has a high heritability. We already know that melting point has a moderate heritability. And we do know that with the omega-3s, you do have very high heritability. So on the basis of that and correlations that we know between parents and their offspring, and the fact that half their genetic makeup would go to that, and if you're using half SIPs, then you know that half of that half, in other words, a quarter, would be moved on. It would be fairly easy to be able to predict, to be able to say, well, this is what we expect. But remember also that, you know, it's a random process. As far as genetic combinations are concerned, you can have 1 or 4 different probabilities. So it may not happen in the first generation, it may be in the second generation, but it is there. While not trying to undermine the role of nutrition, like I said before, unless you have really good environment, you won't be able to bring out the best genetic makeup that your animal has. It will produce quite okay, but if you want to maximize that, you have to combine the genetics and the nutrition in order to get the optimal performance. But from the start breeding point of view, you want to get the best 100% based on genetics. That passes on to the commercial breeder, and from there on, it's a question of how can I get the best out of them. We know that they already have this, and they can pass it on to their offspring. Thank you.